And thanks, Chip, for that introduction. Before I get started, I just want to, as Chip mentioned, I'm now at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, but this is work that I did as a postdoc at the University of Washington, funded by the NMFS Ocean Program. And it wouldn't have been possible without this long list of collaborators that I've got here. And I particularly want to call out Ariel Levine and Tim Essington, who served as co-PIs on that project, and Jackie Vogel, who has been and continues to be a rockstar PhD student on this project. And moving along, I made this slide a couple days ago, and it feels really weird now to be giving the usual intro slide about adapting to environmental change as Hurricane Milton heads up the coast. So I just want to start off by saying that I hope that for folks listening that you've been able to evacuate to safety, and that you and your families and loved ones are doing okay. And I also, in that context, sort of want to mention that I think that adaptation and adaptive capacity they're not a panacea, they can't solve everything, but I still think that it's worth thinking about them and thinking about how to reduce vulnerability and increase adaptive capacity as a way of kind of cushioning against impacts a little bit. And what do I mean by this concept of vulnerability, this concept of adaptive capacity? Where I start from this is the idea that vulnerability is made up of kind of three big ideas. The first one is exposure. So if we're thinking about a fishery, how exposed is that fishery to particular climate events, whether that's heat waves, species distribution shifts, and so on. Then we've got sensitivity. So how reliant are people on the things that are impacted by those climate exposures? And then finally, adaptive capacity. So how can people adapt and take advantage of stressors to transform how they do business while maintaining benefits into the future? And this third concept of adaptive capacity is kind of hard to study and to define. Here's a generic definition that I tend to use, but I actually prefer to think about it in terms of a metaphor, which is when I'm thinking about adaptive capacity, I'm thinking about the difference between sort of you're standing, you're maybe leaning against a wall, you're on one foot, and if somebody were to brush against you, you would kind of stumble and fall over. Versus if you've got more adaptive capacity, you're on the balls of your feet, you're balanced, you're kind of like a runner or a wrestler in that you don't know what direction you're going to have to move in, but you're ready to move sort of however you need to. And that's kind of how I like to think about this trait of adaptive capacity. And there's this growing academic literature on the aspects of fisheries that can sort of help enable that kind of adaptive capacity. And these include things like flexibility, so having the ability to change how you set regulations, or having fishermen who can switch gears and switch species. There's assets, so natural resources are an asset, things like wealth and capital, so that people can buy new permits. Effective organizational structure, the ability for people to learn and innovate, agency, so people's ability to take advantage of new opportunities and act in response to change. And then these socio-cognitive factors, so things like resilience mindset, and these are a little bit less dialed in the literature. And these are not new ideas. This is a figure from my most recent paper, but it's one that we adapted from work that, especially that Josh Sinner has done. And I think that they're a really great framework for thinking about how to adapt to change. But there is a big unanswered question in that literature and within that framework, which is, do these really big picture abstract ideas actually translate into day-to-day decision making in a way that's like useful and replicable? So we know that there are all of these attributes that can theoretically help us adapt to change, but are on-the-ground managers and scientists and leadership at agencies actually thinking about this framework? Is this useful in any way? And what the group that I was a part of was trying to do was basically to do just that. So to kind of reach across that silo between academic research and on-the-ground management, to take these abstract ideas, bring them to managers and say, are these useful to you? And in this project, I'm gonna present 3 big questions that we were trying to answer that are sort of all in that realm. The first question was, what does the US fishery management system need to do in order to adapt to change? That's a really big question. We might have gotten to a partial answer. I don't think we're all the way there. Second, how can this broad field of adaptation and resilient science better meet the needs of managers? So how can people like me better serve people like many of you on this call? And third, what factors might be preventing the US management system from taking these adaptive steps that we identified in question 1? And we used a couple different methodologies to try to answer these questions. For questions 1 and 2, I did a series of in-depth interviews with high-level key informants across the 8 regional fishery management councils, so throughout the US and the territories, and these included council members, staff, NMFS regional office staff, and the NMFS science centers. And that was sort of a body of really in-depth but kind of narrow research. And then to try to broaden that a little bit, we added in an online survey of people across the US fishery management system who are in those same broad categories, but we've reached a much broader population. And I'll go into greater detail about that survey when we get to it. And another point that I want to make about this sort of broad research agenda, I was just looking back at the original proposal for this project from 3 or 4 years ago, and we had a lot of ideas about how information was going to be really important, how we needed to sort of share these ideas of adaptive capacity and make that research more accessible. And I want you to keep that sort of agenda in mind as we move through the talk, because we ended up really changing course, and that ended up kind of not being what emerged as the most important factors here. So to explain what I mean in a little bit more detail, let me just start with this first question of how can the US fishery management system adapt to change? And this is work that was published recently in ICE's Journal of Marine Science. I welcome you to go take a look there. And so I did this series of 20 interviews, and to my surprise, as I was starting to transcribe and analyze those interviews, there was one really broad common theme that kind of emerged across basically every conversation that I had, which is that basically everyone that I spoke to said, in order to become more adaptive to change, we need more flexibility. We need flexibility for fishermen, we need flexibility for managers, and we need flexibility for scientists. So just to put a number to that, this is a plot of how many people thought that each of these aspects of adaptive capacity was relevant or not relevant to their regions. As you can see in that tall purple bar on the left, 19 out of those 20 people said that flexibility was relevant to them. The blue diamonds that are overlaid on those bars shows the number of those people who brought up that concept of flexibility or of assets or organization before I introduced that framework of adaptive capacity. So before being primed with, this is what we think are the most important things to being adaptive. And as you can see from looking at those blue diamonds, 15 out of those 19 people brought flexibility up unprompted, which to me means that it's like really top of mind for people. And that initial exploratory conversation usually went something like, I would ask, what do you think makes a fishery more or less able to adapt to change? And people would say something like, the first principle is flexibility. So do you have the opportunity to change the way that you operate if you're a fisherman? If you're a manager, do you have a variety of policy tools at your disposal? And along with that focus on flexibility, often in the same breath, people would bring up this really important constraint that goes along with that. And in particular, this really fundamental tension between the flexibility that you need in order to adapt, and then the structure of our management system, which limits flexibility in a lot of ways and for a lot of really deliberate reasons. So one council staffer in the Mid-Atlantic, I think, gave a really great example of this. He said, so the National Marine Fisheries Agency is really, I don't know if burdened is the right word, but certainly restricted by their ability to do things quickly. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing all the time, right? Because you want folks to think about a decision, to analyze it, to make sure you understand the impacts before you do it. But if you add up all of the periods that are associated with public scoping and public review and agency review and council analyses, it can be a long period of time. And this issue of timelines is one example of that tension between rigid structures and flexible adaptation, but there were many, many more. And as I thought about this and why this might be, I think that a really important contributor to this tension is that the fishery management system that we have in the US, as was set up under Magnuson, was really set up under the assumption that the future would look more or less like the past, so that you could set your sort of reference points and benchmarks and so on based on past knowledge. And that's becoming pretty obviously untrue. And one fishery scientist in Alaska, I thought, put this really well. Right now, all of our management principles are based around stationarity, and climate change is pushing us away from that at light speed. So what do we do about this? How do we deal with that mismatch? What I argue in that paper in ICJMS is that I think we need to find a new balance between these two goals of having rigorous and participatory and science-driven management and having the ability to be flexible and adaptive in our management strategies. So finding a way to keep the strengths of our current system, which are huge, without letting that bog down innovation and change. And to guide that rebalancing process, what I propose in that paper is this rule of thumb. So try to allow as much flexibility as possible while being really careful to avoid jeopardizing those other adaptive traits. So for instance, don't provide so much flexibility that regulations allow fishing to overshoot biological targets, because then you lose that asset of abundant natural resources. Don't make the management system less participatory, because then fishers won't have agency, which is really important, and so on. And I think that sort of keeping those two things in mind and keeping those trade-offs in mind is really important. I'm not making an argument for sort of broad across the board loosening of regulations, because I think that there are a lot of really important ways that our management system is rigid, but just sort of finding ways where you can mitigate those trade-offs as much as possible. And then the other thing that I think is really important, kind of in order to do that and in order to think about those trade-offs more clearly, is to have really clear conversations about what the goals of fishery management are going forward into an era of greater environmental change. So I thought one scientist on the West Coast put this really well. I think there's going to have to be some sort of dialogue with managers and with fishermen just to say, what do we mean by this? What does flexibility look like? What are the consequences of flexibility? What are the advantages of flexibility? And we have not worked through that at all. So I would argue in answer to that question of how can the US fishery management system adapt more effectively to change, that we need to find a new balance between flexible adaptive strategies and this rigid sort of science-driven participatory structure that we have today. And in companion with that, I also wanted to use these interviews to understand, coming back to that idea that we were really interested in trying to understand information needs among managers and scientists. My second question here was, how can adaptation science, how can people like me better meet managers' needs? And this is work that was also published recently in Marine Policy. And I'm going to structure this talk around, or this portion of the talk around, 3 main action items for scientists in this field. The first one of these is really simple, and it just has to do with language. So one thing that I noticed while doing these interviews is that there was some kind of slipperiness and some confusion about the terms adaptive capacity versus adaptive management as I was doing those interviews. And that makes a ton of sense, because we have been talking and thinking about and implementing adaptive management for like 20 years in fisheries, something like that. And it makes a lot of sense that when you sort of are thinking about a phrase that starts with adaptive, that your brain will sort of auto-complete to management. And I also think that taking an adaptive management approach is definitely one way to increase adaptive capacity overall. But as we think about adaptive capacity in this more kind of abstract high-level literature, we think of it in a more broad and holistic sense. So it's not just what managers are doing, but it's what fishers are doing. It's what's going on in the ecosystem. You can have greater adaptive capacity if there's more genetic diversity in a stock, for instance. So what I would posit is that scientists in this field, like myself, and consider this me doing that right now, kind of need to make sure to clarify our terms and be really clear about what we're talking about. The second point that I want to make, or the second action item, is a little bit more complex. And basically what I learned from doing these interviews is that we as scientists need to do a better job of operationalizing some of these high-level ideas about the traits that we think are important to adaptive capacity so that managers can actually use that. And that, as a corollary to that, I think a really powerful way to make those abstract ideas more concrete is to draw on the insights of practitioners like the people I spoke to. So let me give a couple of examples of that. This is a figure from a paper that I've actually drawn on a lot in my work by Julia Mason and colleagues, published in Fish and Fisheries, which sort of outlines some of the key principles of adaptive capacity. And I think this paper is great. It is also very high level, very complex and abstract. So for example, in this figure here, we see that some of the important aspects of adaptive capacity in governance systems are adaptive learning and cross-scale integration in organizations and polycentric organizations. What does that mean? It took me a while to learn what all of those terms mean, and I have been thinking about this pretty much exclusively for 2 years. So I want to especially pick on this concept of start with this concept of polycentricity, which means that organizations are multi-layered and interconnected across scales. And as you think more about this, the Regional Fishery Management Council system is a really good example of a polycentric organization. There's this hierarchy of national and regional, there's communication across those regional organizations. And one respondent kind of pulled that idea together with the idea of adaptive learning and said, basically, we're not shy about stealing ideas from other councils and improving on them. So translating that like plain text explanation of, or that plain text sort of adaptive strategy into this abstract theory, what I see is, oh, when you have more polycentric organizations, you have more opportunities for adaptive learning. And I think that that is a kind of useful translation between academia and management. Another example that I want to give is, so something that's missing from this figure entirely is the idea of assets in governance organizations. We really tend to think in this field about assets in terms of abundant populations or access to capital for fishermen. But a lot of people that I spoke to who were managers and scientists talked about data and scientific capacity as being a form of asset and as being sort of really key to their own adaptive capacity. So as one example, a council member here in the South Atlantic said, data costs money. If you don't have additional money for new data collection, you just have to spread your existing assets. And a number of other people talked about maintaining data streams for sort of long-term data collection, like surveys, as a really important asset for having enough knowledge and having enough capacity to learn and innovate to respond to new changes. And then the final action item that I extracted from these interviews was that something that like in retrospect is pretty obvious, but I didn't think of in advance, is that we need to be really clear as scientists about time and the timing of change and the timing of adaptation and how those things match up or don't match up. And this came up in interviews in a few different contexts. The first being that environmental change is accelerating. So as one scientist here said, slow is good when climate is changing in the background, but that doesn't help you with a heat wave. Another sort of related point that came up is that there are all these time lags in the adaptation or in the management process that can jeopardize that long-term vision and that long-term adaptive planning. So one scientist here in the Southeast said, our really important species often only get assessed every 5 to 7 years. So from assessment to assessment, you just get a completely different picture. And then the final point that a number of people across regions made was that there are actually risks to, so there are risks to adapting too slowly. There are also risks to adapting too quickly. So one person at the South Atlantic said, if there's a knee-jerk reaction to a perceived change in 1 year, we may do something that looks good this year, but maybe that's a temporary thing. Maybe patterns return more toward normal 2 years down the road, and how does that thing shift back? So this risk of sort of being too reactive and ping-ponging around all over the board, trying to respond to things and kind of not having that longer-term vision. So here are my 3 action items for adaptation scientists. First, working to build a shared definition of adaptive capacity when working in this space. Second, trying to use managers' insights to gain a more nuanced and granular and concrete understanding of what adaptive traits actually look like in fisheries. And then finally, being really cognizant of the appropriate timing of adaptive strategies. And I think especially doing there's some really interesting research questions to ask here about what is the right timeline to adapt to, for instance, species distribution shifts. How can you sort of most effectively balance the need to adapt with the need to maintain revenues and access and so on. So with that, I'm going to switch gears now to this third question, which was answered through that survey that I described before. And we talked about this third question a little bit in the first section of the talk because it came up in the context of that flexibility/rigidity trade-off. But following those interviews, the team that I'm on, we wanted to try to understand this question in a more systematic way. And we especially wanted to look at differences among regions to try to see which barriers were most important where. And we had a lot of hypotheses in advance about sort of where different barriers were going to sort of show up as being the top ones. I want to say in advance that we're actually not going to spend a lot of time talking about regional differences in this section of the talk because that assumption that we had that there were going to be really strong regional patterns was not met. So there was actually a lot more agreement that we were expecting about what those barriers to adaptation were. But before I get into that, I want to give a little bit more detail about what the survey looked like, because I think that's important for understanding these results. So first of all, this is an online survey distributed through Qualtrics. It was live from April to June of 2024. Some of you on this call might have gotten a bunch of emails from me about it. And we targeted people associated with the 8 regional councils and the 3 interstate commissions, and especially we were interested in reaching council and commission members, SSC members, members of advisory bodies associated with given all the FMPs, and then what we're calling technical support staff, so members of management plan teams, working committees, council staff associated with those working committees, and so on. And I want to emphasize that we constructed what's called a non-probability sample. So instead of sort of putting out a link on the internet and saying, please respond to our survey and tell your friends to respond to our survey, we built a list of everybody who fell into those categories at all of those regions. We sort of found email addresses for as many of those people as possible. And that's where our stellar grad student, Jackie, put in a ton of work. And we're able to sort of really granularly describe our sampling frame in terms of what percentage from each region, what percentage of each role, and so on. And this is really powerful because it means that you can tell your response rate really precisely. So in this case, we were able to say we had a response rate of 31%. And you can also tell which regions or roles are under or overrepresented as you're gathering the data. and you can try to course correct as you go with like targeted follow-ups. And that can both help you make sure that you have a more representative sample and also help you interpret results if there are sources of bias. So I want to emphasize that this response rate that we got of 31% is really pretty darn good for an online survey. And also that we were able to tell that response rates for each region and demographic role were pretty proportional to what we saw in the sampling frame. So I would consider our survey responses to be a pretty good representation of overall patterns across regions and across roles in management. And I won't show those tables here, but I'm happy to pull them up if asked. So we asked a ton of questions in the survey. It was a pretty long survey instrument, and Jackie, who I just mentioned, is currently working on understanding some of the answers to the other questions that we asked, but I want to focus here on this question about barriers to adaptation. So in this section of the survey, we started off by asking, there are many reasons not to think about adapting to change when making fishery management decisions. How much do the following statements match your experience? And then we provided a list of specific statements like, I do not have enough information to think about how to improve adaptive capacity in my work. It's hard to adapt to change because my organization lacks opportunities for people to learn and innovate. The timeline for making decisions in my region is too short, and that kind of thing. And this was a list of about 17 or 18 barriers that were developed in consultation with an advisory panel of people who are working in this field from across a bunch of regions, as well as refined through that interview process. And then we asked people about their degree of agreement and disagreement with these statements. So these are Likert scale questions. So when you're asked on a scale from 1 to 5, only in this case, it's strongly disagree to strongly agree, with blue being disagree and red being agree. And that gives you a plot that looks something like this, which I don't expect you to be able to read the text here. We're going to zoom in just a moment. But each row here is giving you the sort of percent agreement and disagreement for a given barrier. And I want to say in advance that we're going to focus mostly here on the top and the bottom of this plot. So the barriers that had the most agreement overall and the barriers that had the least agreement. And we chose to do that because those results about like what was most important and least important were really, really consistent across regions and across roles in management. So we're still working with these data. This is a sort of descriptive section of this talk, but I have a fair amount of confidence that these are generally barriers that are really important and barriers that are really not very important across the US. So the first result that I want to share is briefly that we confirmed what we found in our interviews, that this tension between flexibility and rigidity is really important. So that's the second barrier from the top here with 71% agreement and 15% disagreement. This was in the top 3 for all of the regions except for the Caribbean, and it was the #1 barrier for a couple of regions, for New England and the Western Pacific. And this was also really salient for all roles in management. It was the second top barrier for all of those roles except for the SSC, where it had the highest rate of agreement. And the second result is newer. I want to spend a little bit more time on it. So rigidity versus flexibility was the second most important barrier. The top sort of most agreed with barrier, the most salient barrier, was this one, which is stakeholders in my region are focused on protecting their interests and or the status quo, which makes it difficult to adapt. And this was really true across the board. It had 82% agreement across the entire sample and was in the top 1 or 2 for every single region, which, thinking back to the beginning when I mentioned that we were really interested in information as a key barrier and wanted to try to find ways to provide more information to people involved in management, this kind of surprised me. So I decided to go back to the interviews where I did ask people about barriers to adaptation and try to understand a little bit more about what this barrier looked like in practice. And again, this is work that I'm still doing. This is the roughest section of the talk, I would say, but I do want to highlight one quote that I think is really informative. And this was from a scientist in the Northeast talking about species distribution shifts and quota allocation. And he said, if you're going to give somebody quota, that means you're taking it away from somebody else. And that sort of give and take of quota and of fish creates a real challenge for managers. It becomes a very difficult situation to say, yes, I took your fish away and gave them to somebody 2 states away because that's how we're going to be more adaptive to climate change. Yes, that's how the fishery is going to be more adapted to climate change. It doesn't help me, the fisherman, at all. And I want to make a couple of points here. First, that we've got kind of a trade-off here, coming back to this idea of trade-offs, that there's a difference between flexibility for managers and there's a difference between flexibility for fishermen, and those two things can come into conflict. So as you give managers more options, you restrict the options for fishermen. As you give fishermen more options, you reduce the pathways or the options that managers have. And the second thing that I want to say is that this is a really rational statement on the fishermen's part. So people have vested interests in fisheries. They depend on them for their day-to-day expenses, for paying their mortgage, for their retirement. And it makes a lot of sense that people are going to fight to keep that investment. So I am not trying to say here that, this is all the fault of fishermen who are, selfishly trying to look out for themselves. I think this makes a ton of sense. And then the final point that I want to make on this, in this realm of barriers to adaptation, is these barriers here at the bottom, which are all related to not thinking that change is happening or not thinking that adaptation is necessary. So at the very bottom of this list, we have the statement, I do not think adapting to change is necessary because I don't see change occurring, with only 4% agreement with that statement. The next one up is, I do not believe the concept of adaptive capacity is helpful, with 14% agreement. And then a little bit of a higher rate of agreement with other people in my region think adapting to change is not necessary because they don't see change occurring. And then I'm going to skip a few and then bring in one that's like a couple higher on the list, which is again that one related to information and our role as information brokers as scientists, which is this idea of I do not have enough information about adaptive capacity. And that had only about 33% agreement. So generally my takeaway from this sort of bottom of this plot is the barriers here are not informational, they're not conceptual, they're structural. It's things having to do with the structure of our fishery management system, with the structure of property rights and fisheries, and with really real trade-offs that need to be made. And just supporting that sort of understanding of information not really being a key player here, we also asked people, we presented a little vignette with a definition of adaptive capacity and some examples in the survey, and then we asked, were you familiar with this concept before beginning this survey? And almost 70%, or over 70%, I think, of people said that they were familiar at least with that concept, if not with the concept and with the term. And there was some variation across roles. Not surprisingly, SFC members had a higher rate of familiarity. Advisory panel members had a bit of a lower rate of familiarity. But there's no group here, and there's no region that doesn't have at least 50% rate of familiarity with this term. So really, to me, that sort of solidifies this idea that what we're looking at here are structural rather than conceptual barriers to adaptation. So as I close this talk, I want to leave you with a few key ideas. The first being this key finding of the interviews that we need to kind of find a new balance between flexibility and rigidity as we adapt to change. The second idea that I want to leave you with is that adaptation scientists have a potential role in providing more tangible guidance about what adaptation can look like, especially around that timing of adaptation. And then the third takeaway that I want to make is, even though adaptation scientists, I think, do have a role here, the really important barriers that we're going to have to deal with and address and overcome have to do with the structure of our fishery management system and dealing with the really real costs of adaptation for people who have interests in fisheries. And underlying these three ideas, I think that there's an underlying theme of trade-offs. So basically, I think in all of these sections, there's some evidence that there are these fundamental trade-offs between adaptation for some sectors of fisheries versus adaptation for others. Adapting to one thing can make you less adaptive to another thing. And all of those trade-offs are real, and they're complex, and they have real stakes. But I still think that they're important to talk about, and I think maybe especially they're important to talk about in advance and sort of deliberately over time, because they're only going to get more complicated to navigate as the stakes of those trade-offs get higher. So to close, I would be very happy to take questions and also welcome thoughts about this talk, about this work that we're doing, about this ongoing analysis. As I said at the beginning, I did this work at the University of Washington, but I'm now at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and I've put my current email address at the bottom of the screen there. And I will be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Abby, for a great presentation. And I'm going to take back control real quick. And once again, go over how to operate the webinar. All right. So once again, you can enter a question into the question box here. Make it a little bit bigger. Never mind, can't find my mouse. You can enter it into the question box, which is the larger box down there. Raise your hand by clicking on the icon that looks like a little hand-drawn hand. If it is red, that means your hand is raised. And then in order to unmute yourself, click on the red microphone, and that way we will be able to hear the question that you're asking. So with that, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand. Not seeing any hands raised now or any questions in the question box, so I get to ask my questions. One of the things that I saw, at least in some of the respondents, was down here in the Southeast region, there seemed to be a little bit less knowledge on the adaptive capacity. And I'm just wondering, in the areas where we are more data limited, was that a common theme that you were seeing? Is the information's just not there? And were they responding to other questions similarly, where it just doesn't seem that the information is available to really be able to adapt?
Yeah, I would say that the exception to the broad theme that sort of information isn't a barrier was in the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Those were kind of the only places where I had conversations that started off with like, so what is this concept of adaptive capacity? I've never heard of it before. I'm not really convinced that it's going to be useful here. And I think part of that has to do with the very real data limitations that you mentioned, and capacity limitations, and also the fact that, at least in the interviews that I did, people spoke a lot about spending a lot of time putting out fires and not having a lot of time to think about sort of that long-term visioning.
And another issue we deal with down here is a high percentage of our quota goes to recreational fisheries, which is very different from maybe mid-Atlantic and a lot of the California fisheries as well as Alaskan. Do you think that has some differences as far as adaptive capacity, because it's really, fishermen want the opportunity to go out fishing, and so they want it as adaptive as possible, I would guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it is something that came up a lot in my conversations in those regions. I should also say that my background is in recreational fisheries. I did my PhD on recreational fisheries science and management, and I think that absolutely the value of that opportunity versus just like how many landed pounds can you catch is a really important one, and that really comes back to that question of what are the goals of fishery management, and are the goals, should you be setting different goals in a place or in a fishery that's dominated by a recreational catch versus one that's dominated by commercial or subsistence. So sort of thinking about frameworks beyond MSY, basically.
Yeah, we've definitely had some of those discussions on, you know, it's hard where some of our fisheries are turning to discard fisheries because they just can't. It seems like capacity is or effort's pretty high, and they just can't handle any additional effort in the area. All right. Any other questions? All right, Emmanuel, let me unmute you.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Abigail, for that presentation. I am Emmanuel, a master's student from University of Rhode Island. And currently, I'm actually working on the influence of governance arrangements on the adaptive capacity of small-scale fisheries in Baja California. So I just want to ask, during your research, I want to ask, do you see any point in time where governance arrangements, like maybe cooperative or patron-client relationship, has effect on people's knowledge about adaptive capacity or how they see things, if they see things differently, based on where they belong to?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So to paraphrase the question about sort of the role of cooperatives and other governance systems in influencing people's adaptive capacity and their thinking about adaptive capacity. This actually came up a lot in the North Pacific, where there are some cooperatives in, like, I believe the halibut fishery, where these cooperatives of vessels are making decisions about in-season adjustments and avoiding bycatch and so on. And the managers that I spoke to spoke really positively about that as a adaptive tool and a way to be more nimble without requiring like a huge increase in staffing and scientific capacity at the council level. And they also spoke about the importance of not just having like not just the potential value of those cooperatives, but the importance of having buy-in early on about the value of those cooperatives. So having them be kind of ground up versus top down as a tool was really important in them being successful.
All right, thank you for that.
All right, Laura. Laura, I see your hands raised. Laura,
I see I'm unmuted. Can you hear me, Chip?
Yes, we can.
I can't actually hear you. I think I saw your head, Abigail, so I'm gonna ask my question, but I can't hear the response, unfortunately. So I was just wondering when you spoke about flexibility, I was wondering in the course of your survey if you were able to sort of more details about what that meant to specific people. And I know you had the specific groups broken down, and I'm really curious because that I think is something that I also hear a lot in conversations, and I'd be, I'd love to hear people's ideas about what they mean when they say flexibility for fishers and managers.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't see our grad student, Jackie Vogel, on this call, but she's the one who's been digging a little bit more deeply into those adaptive traits. And if I can summarize her work as it is now, and which I'm going to do imperfectly because she's the one who's been diving into those data, we've been asking a little bit more specifically about different kinds of flexibility, different kinds of organizational traits, and so on. And one thing that's jumped out to me in looking at that is that the traits related to flexibility, people see them as more cutting both ways than some of the other traits. Like, for example, when we ask about like learning, everyone is like, yes, learning is very important. Learning supports adaptation. When we talk about species are ecologically flexible because they can move through space, there's a sizable minority who say actually that actually constrains our ability to adapt, because then you have issues like species moving across jurisdictional boundaries, or people saying when fishermen are more able to switch gears, that causes other problems. Or this is me extrapolating a little bit, but the idea of fishermen's flexibility to switch gears and species in some ways supports adaptation, in some ways constrains it. So that's an imperfect response to your question, but I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that across these specific flexibility traits related to flexibility, there is a little bit more nuance about, yes, they're useful and they're also a challenge. And I would also point you to that ICES JMS paper where we talk a little bit more about what flexibility looks like in particular cases.
Thank you. I hope Laura was able to hear that, but if not, I will get a response to her, and so she gets the answer. And I apologize for my other warnings being up on the screen. I didn't see them. Any other questions? So would you have any recommendations on how council members can deal with this, or managers can really deal with this in order to address it? It's for the longest time, the South Atlantic wasn't necessarily seeing a lot of issues as far as potential climate change, and now it's really starting to set in, maybe in the past 10 years, where several of the primary species are seeing recruitment declines in them.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I also want to be clear that I'm wearing my UW postdoc hat and not my NMFS scientist hat here. I mean, these are still pretty broad principles, right? I think a lot of these solutions kind of have to be region specific, but some common themes that have come up across conversations that I've had are the importance of setting these longer term goals and sort of figuring out what that long-term vision is, and then putting in place a structure for getting incrementally towards them, both as a way of avoiding the trap of just trying to, put out fires every year or 2 years, and then also coming back to that stakeholder related barrier of people focusing on what they have to lose, is that if you agree to a pathway beforehand, it makes it easier then to implement that when it actually happens. So like a harvest control rule for allocation or whatever. Decision rules, yeah.
Were your interviews after the climate scenario planning had started on the East Coast, or were you aware of that project going on?
Yeah, it came up a bunch in interviews. I did the interviews, I would say, after the West Coast had completed theirs and while the East Coast was in progress.
Okay.
Yeah. And before like the Climate Ecosystem and Fisheries Initiative was thought of, really.
Right. All right, well, we don't want to take up your whole day, and I really appreciate the conversation today and the questions that folks had. If you have any questions, you can see Abigail's email down there. She will be putting on her NOAA hat and responding to emails. So once again, thank you, Abigail, for a great presentation. I think we learned a lot, and I think we'll be using this information going forward.
Thanks, Chip. Thanks so much for the invitation. And again, stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.